Vice Project Doom was released for the Nintendo Entertainment System in November of 1991. This release date puts the game's release ahead of both the North American and Japanese releases of the Super Nintendo by a few months. At this point in the NES's life cycle, developers really were starting to know how to squeeze every last drop of power out of the NES games, and Vice Project Doom is no exception. Developed by ICOM and published by Sammy, Vice Project Doom is an action game that spans 3 different genres. Most of the game consists of side-scrolling levels, however, the game also includes 2 driving levels, which are reminiscent of Spy Hunter, and 2 shooting levels similar to LJN's Punisher. The variety contained in the game makes it a great value, and for the most part, all the levels are fun. Vice Project Doom has a surprisingly in-depth plot for an 8-bit title. The plot's delivered in cutscenes between the levels in a similar fashion to Ninja Gaiden. The plot takes place in the future where a mega-corporation is a front for a group of alien beings. The corporation develops an addictive drug that has crazy side effects that they begin selling to the underworld. As the game's protagonist, Detective Hart, it's your job to investigate the disappearance of your partner who went missing. During the investigation, Hart goes down the rabbit hole discovering what the alien corporation is up to. You could really read into the plot as much as you'd want, because there's actually a ton of it there, but it's fairly convoluted, and even after beating the game 5 times, I'm still not exactly sure what happens. It features some cliché moments at just the right amount of 80s dystopian future movie and action tropes to keep the plot quaint. It's cool that the game developers decided to include this much plot in the game from this era, but I don't think anyone would really fault you for skipping them and getting back to the action, as they do run a little long when compared to the lengths of the stages. The game opens with a big surprise cutscene. Once you actually make it into the actual game, the first level starts out like a Spy Hunter level where you're driving a car. The driving levels in this game tend to be extremely easy, and I don't think many people would have any issues beating them. As with many games, the number of bullets you're able to shoot are related to the number of bullet sprites the game allows on the screen at one time, so the closer you get to enemies, the faster you shoot. The car levels are a nice distraction, however due to their lack of difficulty, they're a little on the boring side. That's not to say I'd like a Spy Hunter level of difficulty on these stages. I don't want it so hard that lasting more than a minute is a miracle, but I do think they could have done more with the car levels. After the driving stage, and another cutscene, you'll be in the game's bread and butter, the first side-scrolling level. There's a number of things that make these levels extremely well polished. As Detective Hart, you have 3 options for attack on the side-scrolling levels. You have a laser whip, a gun, and grenades. The laser whip, despite having the shortest range, features the quickest attack speed, which makes it great for almost every situation as both offensive and a defensive weapon. One of the unique things about the laser whip is how it moves when attacking. You swing the whip from behind you, causing one of the 3 frames you attack to deal damage to anything behind you. This makes the whip a great defensive weapon for enemies coming at you or coming at you from above. The other 2 weapons in the game, the gun and the grenades, both take ammo, limiting how much you can use them. This really isn't ever an issue though, because ammo is pretty abundant in this game. The gun has a longer range than the whip, however only shoots a short distance ahead of you. This is a great option to use on enemies that use projectiles that appear directly in front of you. The grenades have the longest range of any of the weapons, however are thrown at an arc, so using it on things that are super close is pretty much impossible. This becomes a great weapon for projectile using enemies that are on different platforms than you, and can be helpful when taking out enemies that require more than 2 hits to kill, as the grenade has lingering damage after it explodes that'll do 2 damage on most enemies rather than 1. After finishing the side-scrolling level on level 2, you'll be introduced to the game's first boss. The bosses in Vice Project Doom are challenging at first, but quickly become tame once you realize their patterns. Boss fights are the most memorization-heavy parts of the game, however the majority of these bosses have patterns that are easy to decipher after a few tries, and in no time you'll be able to take them out within a few seconds. The boss of level 3 is a great early example of this. He jumps around the screen blowing fireballs and occasionally doing a sweep of the bottom platform. This boss seems hard at first, but once you realize the strategy to beat him, he goes down within seconds. Many of the bosses are like this, and if you can find an opening to their pattern, they become extremely easy. There's also many ways you can go about taking out a boss with the various weapons you have at your disposal. You can go quick and aggressive with the laser whip, or more methodical with the grenades. By level 4, the game introduces the first of the first-person shooting levels. These, much like the car levels, are really easy. The only thing you have to worry about on these levels is ammo management, because it's extremely easy to dump all your ammo, especially if you play with the turbo controller. These levels are pretty easy. All you have to do is shoot anything that moves before it stabs or shoots you. By using a combination of grenades to take out groups of enemies and the gun to take out single foes, it shouldn't be a problem for anyone to get through these levels. One of the best features of this game is just the standard enemies. Every enemy in this game has a predictable movement and attack pattern. This keeps most of the levels from being extremely memorization heavy, with the exception of the bosses. Some of the game's enemies can be pretty difficult to deal with though. On stage 5, the game introduces the first of these difficult enemies with the pink birds. Aside from being hard to hit, they're also extremely aggressive. The only opportunity you'll have to take them out with the laser whip is when they're already attacking you, and the rest of the time they're out of range for the gun and usually the grenades as well. To make things worse, they don't just attack once, but instead swoop down and attack you an additional time if you don't kill them on their first pass. The birds have to be one of the most annoying enemies in the entire game. While the difficulty on each level slowly rises, the game takes a drastic leap from the previous levels in Stage 5-2, where it introduces projectile-shooting fish with the relentless birds, while it makes you do some somewhat difficult platforming. Vice Project Doom, like many games on the NES, has knockback when you get hit, like Castlevania. The platform isn't nearly as confined as the original Castlevania games, but the knockback when hit is still in the same vein. This can make platforming in some areas, especially ones riddled with difficult foes, a difficult task. However, with a little bit of memorization, this becomes doable, albeit a little frustrating. This game can actually be really cheap at times. At the beginning of Stage 7, there's a number of guys with guns with super cheap placement that'll knock you off ledges, killing you. The rest of Stage 7 is fairly easy, where you'll be working your way through a sewer, but the boss fight on Stage 7 is without a doubt the hardest in the game. Even if you know the pattern for it perfectly, it's still pretty difficult. When I first played through the game, I got stuck on this guy for around 40 minutes. After Stage 7, the game throws you a bone with level 8 before becoming soul-crushingly hard for the remainder of the side-scrolling levels of the game. Level 10 consists of a car level, and level 11 starts out with another first-person shooting level. Both these levels are more difficult than their earlier counterparts, however, don't really pose a challenge compared to most of the final few side-scrolling levels. The final level, level 11, at first glance is extremely challenging, however by learning to use the knockback damage in your favor, it becomes drastically easier than many of the previous levels. After defeating the game's final boss, the plot comes to a close with yet another long cutscene. On my first playthrough this game, it took me roughly 2 hours to complete, however after beating the game 4 times since then, it only takes about 30 minutes to go through the game if I'm rushing. This is without a doubt a game you can master. Vice Project Doom does a wonderful job of balancing difficulty and playability, and the game offers a taste of NES hard, but with its unlimited continues and learnable strategies, it's a beatable NES game that'll force you to learn it to beat it. For my money, Vice Project Doom balances challenge and playability better than most games on the library on the NES. Graphically, Vice Project Doom doesn't stand out as being amazing, as many of the best-looking games on the NES tend to lean towards cartoony graphics. Vice Project Doom's graphics tend to lean towards more realistic. Well, as realistic as it can be with enemies wearing pumpkin heads that throw boomerangs. The realistic graphics don't look bad, but they do look busy with the screen being packed with detail. The environments tend to look better than the sprites, usually featuring a lot of movement in the levels. The driving stages tend to be the weakest link in the game's aesthetics, looking fairly simple, and in 1991 probably looked a little dated, especially with the 16-bit consoles already having been rolled out. Probably the weakest part of this game's overall package is the soundtrack. The audio isn't bad, however when compared to all the other really standout elements of the game, it feels so middle of the road for such a great package. The soundtrack overall sounds extremely generic. You could easily match this game's music with pretty much any other game and it would probably fit, which really is a shame considering how much effort the developers put into giving the game a certain vibe through its plot and cutscenes, only to have the soundtrack feel so generic by comparison. In May of 1991, Vice Project Doom was actually the cover game for Nintendo Power's 24th issue. This actually is a little strange because the game wasn't released for another 6 months after this issue. The article in this issue of Nintendo Power does give some pretty cool level layouts and some pretty bad advice. It's worth looking at if you want to know some more back info on some of the game's enemies. According to PriceCharting.com, Vice Project Doom is currently worth $27. This game has seen a massive surge in pricing over the past few months, being worth far under $20 just a year ago. The price for this game still seems erratic, so if you're looking to add it to your collection, you'd be better off getting it sooner than later. Overall, Vice Project Doom is a true hidden gem on the NES. It has a great balance of difficulty and gameplay, making it one of the most rewarding games to play on the NES. The game features 3 different action genres in one package, and even though 2 of them feel like afterthoughts, that's still quite a feat for a game of this era. I can't really say anything bad about this game, other than that the music is a little lacking. If you're interested in having among the best experiences you can have on the NES, look no further than Project Doom.